Today we're going to have an introduction to narratology and how it applies to Beloved. So our objective for this video is for you to be able to analyze how Morrison uses narrative point of view as a technique that reveals the importance of power in storytelling. So narratology, what is this? It is the study of narrative, and it's asking the question, how do narratives work? How are stories functioning? And so part of narratology is looking at the difference between the tale, which is the sequence of events in the order that they take place, versus the telling of a story. The telling of a story is the sequence of events in the order that they are told. Now, already in Beloved, you've seen that there's a difference between the tale of what happened chronologically and the telling of how the story is actually told. Here are some terms for you guys to know. Anytime the author flashes back, this is called analepsis, and then anytime the author flashes forward, this is prolepsis. So those are some terms to be aware of. The tale includes all of the events that takes place. However, sometimes in a telling, we might leave details out, and those details will produce gaps in the narrative. And we call this ellipsis, anytime there is a gap in the narrative. And that's a really interesting place for us as readers to explore, because we want to know, what are these differences between the tale and the telling? How does this matter for the story, its art, and its meaning, that the telling follows its own sequence instead of the sequence of the tale, or someone else's sequence of how they might tell the story itself. So you might be wondering, how does this apply to Beloved? Well, here's an example. We have the actual tale, the order of events, where the school teacher comes to bring Setha and her children back into slavery. Setha kills her crawling already baby using a saw and would have continued to kill her children if she wasn't stopped. She's then taken to jail with baby Denver. But in Beloved, this is told from a variety of different perspectives. In chapter 16, we have the perspective of the slave catcher and the school teacher who are telling the story, telling the tale, as it were. In chapter 17, to make things even more complicated, we hear Paul D's reaction to hearing the story from Stampede. And then we hear Stampede's internal thoughts about what he remembers having happened. And then in chapter 18, we have Setha telling her own version of the tale when she talks to Paul D. And as we read all of these different tellings of the same tale, we want to think about, what are each of these tellings emphasizing, or perhaps even de-emphasizing or omitting? What kinds of cultural codes are being revealed in the way that the tale is told? So, for example, the language that the slave catcher and the school teacher uses, they have a lot more racial slurs that they use. They have a lot of harsh and critical diction that is being used that we don't see in Setha, Paul D, or Stampede's discussion of the story. So we can know who is the narrator based off of some of those cultural codes because of what they believe comes through in their language. So narration has lots of different ways that it can happen, but sometimes there are embedded stories. Embedded stories are these stories within stories, where the narrative has a framing story that is on the outside, and there's another story that is within the frame. And you might be wondering, what is the effect of embedding? And that's a question that we want to ask as we are reading Beloved. Perhaps by having a frame story, the outside story makes us read the inside story differently, or more skeptically, or more critically, or the inside story makes us read the outside story more critically. So let's take a look at chapter 17. In chapter 17, there's different layers or nested stories within the story. For example, when we first open the chapter, we hear Paul D's reaction. He talks about "that ain't her mouth." And we know that this is the immediate story that's taking place. It's Paul D's reaction to Stamp's story, which means that inside, another layer in, it's the story that Stamp tells Paul D with the clipping that he shows him and with what he tells Paul D about what he knows about Setha. But then we have a further story that's even more inside, and this is the story that Stamp doesn't tell Paul D, but that we as readers get an opportunity to know and understand and listen to. For example, he goes into more detail as he recollects Setha grabbing her children, and he remembers his placement where he was and the axe that the axe that's nearby, and all of those different details. So when we are looking at narration, this causes us, and especially these frame stories, cause us to think about who is doing the telling of the story. Which narrators can we consider reliable? And as we ask that question, I hope that you guys can tell that because of all of these different layers of story, that all narrators have some sort of subjective perspective that is not a quote, big T truth. All of us, even we as readers, may interpret something differently than a narrator's way of interpreting it, which means this idea of an omniscient narrator doesn't fully exist in the idea of an omniscient narrator as God, because we know that there's something that an exterior narrator, that there will always be something that an exterior narrator won't know. And we can always find ways that we don't trust that omniscient narrator's understanding or interpretation. We might have a different perspective, and therefore they're not totally omniscient. They're still presenting a subjective reality. Sometimes, if we trust an omniscient narrator too carefully, it could also lead us astray in our interpretation. So this brings us, when we're talking about perspective, to this important idea called focalization in critical theory. Focalization is a fancy, clunky term that just means perspective or point of view. But what is unique about it is that when we talk about focalization, it means a character's perspective doesn't always come through a character's voice. So when we are reading a text, sometimes we might have what the school teacher thinks doesn't come through their voice, but it comes through this other narrator. So often an exterior third-person narrative voice recounts or tells events by describing the perspective of an interior character. We see this with the slave catcher, we see this with school teacher, that they are telling the story about Setha, but it's still being told as if it's an omniscient narrator, and yet we are seeing a limited view from their point of view. The point to calling the slave catcher a focalizer is to show that the angle of mind comes through the character, not the narrator. So you guys are going to want to learn this idea of focalization and who is the focalizer. Here is an example. So this is at the very beginning of chapter, I think it's 16, when the four horsemen come. We have school teacher, one nephew, one slave catcher, and a sheriff. And then as you read, this is like more information that happens, but then it slowly, as if this was a movie, we get to see things through one person's type of eyes or mind. So for example, it goes and it says 3 of them dismounted, one stayed in the saddle, his rifle ready, his eyes trained away from the house to the left and to the right, because likely as not the fugitive would make a dash for it. So we're in the mind of the slave catcher who is still on the horse. And then it says, although sometimes you can never tell, you'd find them folded up tight somewhere beneath the floorboards in a pantry, once in a chimney. Even then care was taken because the quietest ones, the ones you pulled from a press, a hayloft, or ones from a chimney, would go along nicely for 2 or 3 seconds. So all of this is not what the narrator is telling us. This is all from the mind and the perspective of the slave catcher. So the third person narrator is drifting into the perspective of the slave catcher's thoughts. So now the slave catcher is the internal focalizer, the person who is doing the viewing. How do we know that it's the slave catcher who's doing the thinking and the sharing? we might consider whose eyes or mind does the narration look or think through. And this is going to be really important, especially when you guys are looking at stream of consciousness later. You're going to want to look for clues that let you know who is the person doing the speaking. So some clues that we have here, this person has a knowledge on slave catching. He uses the N-word. He also lacks care about the humanity of the slaves because he talks about the lack of profit that you could get from bringing in a dead slave into bringing back a dead slave. So all of those things are clues that we are inside the internal focalizer of the slave catcher. So how do you analyze this? Here are some questions to ask as you're doing your analysis. Who or what is the focalized, which means the object of the focalizer's attention? In some of this, we saw that we go into the mind of the school teacher, and he is looking at Setha and looking at the scene, and he is witnessing them. So he is the focalizer, and the focalized are Setha and her children. What do we learn through that moment about the relationship between the focalizer and the focalized? What kind of power dynamics are there? What are their feelings towards each other? Is the focalizer consistent in a passage, or does it shift? And we see that the focalizer shifts even within chapter 16. We go from the slave catcher's point of view and then into the mind of the school teacher. And it doesn't really show you a example. It doesn't show you very clearly when that happens. If it shifts, the narrator, how frequently, and does it matter? And what is the effect of this shift on the story? Does anything in particular trigger this type of shift? And what difference does the trigger make, or the lack of one? These are questions that you'll definitely want to be looking at in terms of stream of consciousness in your upcoming chapters. So narration, all of this, the idea of story brings up this question of power. When we think about who is doing the storytelling, who is the person who's doing the seeing, this helps us analyze who are the figures that are in power and who is disempowered in a story. So when we're analyzing power, we want to ask ourselves, who is doing the speaking, who is doing the seeing, who is a spectator, who is an object, and whose story is being told, and through what kind of subjectivity. Now that takes us into this idea about patriarchy and the male gaze. You may have heard about this, but Lisa Mulvey, in her 1975 essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, coined the term the male gaze. And what the male gaze is this idea that women are objects for male fetishistic gazing. It means that men are the viewers or the focalizers, and women are the objects or the focalized. You can't really summarize it any better than this quote that says, "To gaze implies more than to look at. It signifies a psychological relationship of power in which the gazer is superior to the object of the gaze." So they took what was meant for film, and now we can apply it to cultural studies, and we can examine who is the person that is gazing, who's the person who's doing the viewing, who's doing the focalizing, who's doing the storytelling about, and then who is the object of that, who is disempowered, who is the object of this. So the focalizer, the person viewing or gazing as the storyteller, is the one who has power. And that makes us question, how are the prejudices influencing us as a reader or the characters in the story when that person is telling a story? So here are some questions to consider. What was used for feminist theory and criticism, we can now apply to cultural studies, and we can examine how are white people viewing Black people in Beloved, how are Black people viewing Black people, how are Black people viewing white people. We can consider this dynamic and this interchange of gazing and also of focalizing. So some questions to consider: in the days of slavery, who had the power of gazing, who were the objects? And then continuing on, like, what is significant about Setha telling her own story? What is complicated about how Paul D is sitting and listening to it? And in what role is he in as a listener? Is he sitting in judgment over her, or how is he acting in this role? Who has the power in that moment? Why might Morrison have provided multiple focalizers to reveal the tale about Setha? And what biases does each focalizer have? And what position are we put in as readers as we read the story? So you guys are going to have some time to be able to try to apply this analysis to you'll be able to apply focalizing and narration and the importance of that in writing a paragraph. You're going to be choosing a focalizer from chapter 16, 17, or 18, whether it be Setha, Paul D, Stampede, School Teacher, or The Slave Catcher. And in one paragraph, you're going to analyze how their perspective influences how they tell the story, what details they include, the diction they use, the method of telling the story, whether it's indirectly or directly. What might Morrison's purpose be in having that focalizer tell the story in that way? A lot of this content came from the wonderful book, How to Interpret Literature, and I will be sharing with you guys the chapter link so you can read it in its entirety. Thanks, everyone.